Hi there, Meera Belle with Pitch Perfect Vocal Studio's first lesson, which is how do we produce sound? I know that this is going to sound really strange, but I always ask my students to try and explain to me how they would tell a child about sound. What is sound? Sound is the vibration of air molecules. Air molecules will only vibrate if they move at speed. The only way that we can produce sound in the body is by bringing air into our lungs and then pressuring the air back out through our vocal cords. Now, as I've said before, there's lots of resources on YouTube where you can see how vocal cords work and how breath function works. I think for the purposes of an introductory lesson here, what I would say to you is that the way that you produce air pressure is crucial to the quality of your singing sound, because air pressure is part of that system of signals that lets your vocal apparatus know what you're trying to do. If you're going to speak, you're not going to put as much pressure through your vocal cords. If you're trying to shout, you're going to put a lot of pressure through your vocal cords. But singing isn't about speaking or shouting. Singing is actually very, very close to speaking, but singing is about sustaining sound. When we speak, we can take a breath whenever we want to take a breath, and so we're not subject to the elongation of that sound. But when we sing, what we're trying to do is sustain the sound. So we're going to be using the air pressure slightly differently, even though we're using the same apparatus as we would to speak or to shout or to whisper. So what is the difference between speech and singing in terms of air pressure? For singing, we need a little more air and we need it to move more swiftly. We need more pressure on the air. So when we take what we call a singing breath, what we're seeking to do is to bring the breath down a little bit lower than we normally would for speaking. And we want to bring it down far enough to push the diaphragm down so that the muscles around our waistband, our floating rib, top of the hips, and the abdomen can kind of cuddle around the diaphragm and start to control its ascent. When we can control the diaphragm, we can then control the elongation of sound, if you like. Again, I think that there are probably better resources than listening to me for you to be able to go and have a look at that. But for now, I'm going to talk about breathing, because breath is the fuel that ignites your voice. And a really, really good breathing system will actually also enhance the way that you form your vowels, the way that you sustain your vowels, and everything else. It's kind of like one of those domino pictures. If all the dominoes are set up beautifully, then all you have to do is just flick the first domino and the picture reveals itself. So remember what I said in the introduction about this being a system of neurological signals, and one ticks off the other. So the quality of signal that you give can make a huge difference to the quality of your sound. So quality of breath is really, really important. I often tell my students that setting up to sing, you don't start singing when you make the sound, you start singing when you take the breath. And it's a little bit like being an archer. You know, the whole thing about being an archer, it isn't just about hitting the target. It's about the selection of the materials that you're going to use, the quality of your bow, the quality of your arrows, the way that you actually set the arrow up in the bow, the tension that you bring onto that arrow through the bow. All of that has to be done before you let that bow fly. And most crucially, once you let the bow fly, you've got to trust that you set it up well enough for it to hit the target, because it's not like you can run after the arrow and say, hey, you're 5 degrees off, we need to change it, because as a singer, you're already taking your next breath for your next phrase. That's why breathing is the start of singing, and that's why what you can set up in your breath can determine the quality of your singing phrase. Okay, so where do we start? We start with relaxed breathing, and we start with something that I call the silent breath. This is based on really, really, really old teaching, like centuries old teaching, where some teachers would require their students to breathe while having a candle in front of them, and if the candle flickered, then they hadn't taken the breath correctly. I think we can probably move on a little bit from that by saying that we need to breathe on an open throat, and not all singers can feel what an open throat feels like. But there's a couple of little tricks that you can use to feel what an open throat feels like. A really quick way is just to say that you take a silent breath. So I've just taken a silent breath. Why is a silent breath important? Well, there's a really good physiological reason for that, and that is if we take a breath that we can hear, it means that a neurological signal has been triggered, and that brings the esophageal flap down across the air pipe. Now, this is an ancient signal from old times when we were cavemen and cave women. And because remember, we still have the same bodies as we had, hundreds of thousands of years ago. If you took a sharp intake of breath, it was a signal to the body that there was some kind of distress or some kind of fright going on. And the esophageal flap would come over the air flap, because remember, it comes over the air flap to put food in the food pipe. It would automatically be triggered to prevent you from accidentally breathing in an insect or whatever, accidentally breathing in dust. So a sharp intake of breath, if you can hear the breath, you know the esophageal flap has been triggered. If you take a silent breath, you actually have to calm down, which is a good thing for a singer, and you actually have to flex the throat a little bit more openly to take that breath. And don't forget, there's a good reason too why singers take their breath in through the mouth and not the nose. Your nostrils are pointing downwards and they're tiny. So for you to take enough breath for your average singing phrase, it's going to be too little, too long. Whereas if you just keep your mouth open, you can pretty much inflate your lungs quickly. So that's why I teach my singers to breathe through the mouth, not through the nose, and to breathe silently when they're doing their exercises. So what they're setting up is a habitual response to singing, because don't forget, and that's the other thing that I want to leave you with in this little lesson, every time you sing, you are learning to sing. Every time you emit a sound, you are teaching your apparatus how to produce that sound. So take that away as a very important lesson. Everything that you do in your technical exercises, I don't call them warm-up exercises because we're speaking all the time, our apparatus is warm. But if we want to elongate the sound and sing singing phrases, we need to fuel those phrases with the appropriate breath. And so when we do technical work, warm-ups, what we're doing is we are learning to put in place all of those essential technical responses that are going to sustain our singing phrases. And it starts with a silent breath. All right, we'll have more in the next episode.